My name is Stefano Mazzocca, and for this oral presentation, I will analyse the key themes and literary devices used in W.B. Yeats' poem Easter 1916, as well as the historical events that inspired his work. Before getting into the poem and the periodical events, I'd like to give a brief introduction on Yeats in the years leading up to the writing of the poem. Yeats was born on the 13th of June 1865 in Dublin. Despite being born in Ireland, Yeats spent much of his childhood in Britain, as his father was studying art in London. Yeats remained there until 1880, before returning back to Dublin with his family and embarking on his high school education. After meeting Maud Gonne, Yeats was introduced to Irish nationalism and the idea that Ireland needed to become an independent state. Yeats fell in love with her, and ultimately he was unable to pursue her as she chose the Irish soldier John McBride's hand in marriage. So, for a bit of context, we need to understand what nationalism is. And nationalism is the ideology that is forged in the beliefs and actions that conceive the nation as the most important unit of human solidarity and political legitimacy. So, now let's take a look at the backdrop of the events leading up to the Easter Rising. So, the Easter Rising took place after years of increasing political tension in Ireland. Much of this tension can be attributed to the differences in opinion between Northern and Southern Ireland resulting from the proposal of the Home Rule Bill. Implementation of the proposed Home Rule would give Ireland a semi-independence from Britain. So this would mean that Ireland would have their own parliament in Dublin while still retaining Britain as their head of state. Ireland was divided on the Home Rule, as many people from the northern parts were worried of the implications it would have on the wealth that they had attained in industries that were fostered by the unity of Britain and Ireland. The bill was rejected twice in 1886 and 1893 before being passed in 1912. However, there was a 2-year delay before it was implemented in 1914, and in those 2 years, tensions amassed to a near civil war between Northern and Southern Ireland. This was only disrupted by the beginning of the First World War. So let's talk about the events of the Easter Rising. So, World War I provided the opportunity for 1,200 Irish nationalists led by the Irish Republican Brotherhood to occupy the Dublin General Post Office, or the GPO, and other key buildings across the city. This was the beginning of the Easter Rising on the 24th of April 1916, and it would last for 6 days. The Rising was not viewed with popularity at the beginning, however it gained momentum as the leaders were executed by the British, giving a status of martyrdom to those who'd lost their lives during the uprising. We can see in the image some of the key figures who led the movement. Pay attention to their names, as I will be referring back to them in a few moments. So now that we have some historical context, let's have a look into the poem itself. So Yeats's Easter 1916 is a patriotic poem that pays tribute to those who lost their lives during the Easter Rising, whilst also reflecting on his own conflicting views on the events. The text utilises Yeats' transformative writing style of what we call the occasional poem. This is a poem that celebrates particular events of public character, such as a political crisis. Whilst this poem is typically written in a tone situated or appropriate for a forum, Yeats is transformative in his approach, as the tone for Easter 1916 is more sombre, closely resembling his own inner thoughts of his meditation and reflection on the events that transpired. Whilst Yeats supported the movement towards independence, he was not fond of the violence that occurred during the Rising. Throughout the poem, Yeats explores the theme of sacrifice and the cost of bloodshed. The oxymoronic refrain, "A terrible beauty is born," is repeated throughout the poem. It is symbolic of the notion that through terrible events a new beginning can arise. This is also representative of Yeats's internal conflict with his national views of admiration for the patriotic acts demonstrated by the rebels and his sadness for those lives lost. The second stanza of the poem pays tribute to the fallen leaders known by Yeats. The final stanza includes a powerful tribute to those folk and Yeats, as he states, "We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonough and McBride, and Connolly and Pearce, and now in time to be, wherever green is worn. The distant reflective tone of these lines reflects his sadness for the needless loss of life as he ponders with the notion of what might have been achieved by those individuals if their lives hadn't been lost in the rebellion. He immortalises the names of his friends and acquaintances. His use of imagery when emphasising the colour green further pays ode to those nationalists, as green is the national colour of Ireland. This questioning of violence is also explored in an earlier part of the final stanza, where Yeats is arguably expressing his grief. He states, "Oh, when may it suffice? Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith." In these lines, we continue to see the reflective tone in this occasional poem, as Yeats highlights the fact that Ireland might still have been granted independence by Britain. In this way, he continues to explore the cost of the rising. Was it worth all the fighting? Arguably, the terrible beauty may be interpreted as the idea that the sacrifice was in vain if Ireland was still going to be granted independence by the British. Throughout the poem, Yeats employs the metaphors of stone and water to represent the strengths and determination of the rebels in the face of rapid political change and turmoil. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter, seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. This is quite deep with lots to unpack. In this phrase, Yeats compares the determination of the rebels to a stone in a stream. The rushing water acts as a metaphor for the rapid changes that are taking place in Ireland, whilst the stone, the fighting cause of the rebels, does not move despite all of the movement of the water above and remains grounded. This metaphorical stone is further transformed at the beginning of the final stanza. Yeats states, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart." This creates a negative connotation, as a heart of stone cannot be moved by emotions. The rebels have fought hard, and they have lost touch with their sensibilities as a result of the fighting. Their hearts have been hardened. So, to wrap up this brief presentation on the text, we can see that Yeats is writing to commemorate the memories of those who fought in the Easter Rising, whilst also immortalising the human and moral costs of the event. He grapples with the immense loss of life caused by the fighting and explores the notion of vast political change. Thank you for listening, and here are my references.